reforms to meet the high standards that it set for itself. That's our core message of this report, this task force. We formed this task force 1 year ago because we were concerned about a lack of clarity in policy, concerned about simmering differences between the United States and Europe and within Europe. We were concerned about the normalization of the status quo of occupation in Kazakhstan, concerned that this was becoming a creeping annexation as Russia built up its military presence and stopped to destabilize Georgia. And we've been concerned about this as the backdrop as Georgia faces two critical tests heading forward politically in 2012 parliamentary elections and 2013 presidential contest. So the purpose of this effort was to assess and reinvigorate policy towards Georgia, to forge a bipartisan approach that advances Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration, and to lay out a roadmap for Georgia's democratization and its integration. We put together a set of recommendations that hopefully the government of Georgia can embrace, the opposition, and civil society can embrace. So I want to take a moment to thank our co-chairs for agreeing to lead this effort. When we kicked this off, Senator Hagel, the chairman of the Atlantic Council, he announced the launch of this task force by saying that we have in Senators Graham and Senator Shaheen leaders that are respected and serious in the Senate. They will provide credible and important leadership for this effort. We're delighted to have you join us, Senator Graham. I'm going to turn to my colleague and turn over the floor.
Let me just say briefly to welcome Senator Graham and to say what an honor it's been to have the two senators as our co-chairs. I think Senator Graham does not need much of an introduction, but I just want to mention that he's a former active duty Air Force officer, a lawyer, and he now continues to serve with the reserves, doing tours in, I believe, of Afghanistan and Iraq. He served South Carolina in the U.S. House of Representatives, starting in 1994 until elected to the Senate in 2002. He's a member of Appropriations, Armed Services, Budget, and Judiciary Committees. So thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm from the federal government. I'm here to They even laugh in Georgia that good. I think they give a joke all over the world. The Congress is pretty dysfunctional now, but it's good to have some bipartisanship. Senator Jeanne has been a great ally in this endeavor to talk about our friends in Georgia. You know, I have Georgia on my border and Georgia on my line. So, Mr. Bachelor, good to see you again. This Atlantic Council, to the Atlantic Council, thank you. This is a very in-depth analysis of the challenges facing Georgia within and without. It is very important for me that Georgia turn out well. It is one of the centerpieces of this new movement to that part of the world that preceded the Arab Spring, where people in the former Soviet Union had a chance to start over. They've embraced this chance to start over with a new way of living that I think will be beneficial to the world at large. And success in Georgia, I think, validates what is going on in the Arab world in many ways. People who come out of totalitarian regimes that have a chance for freedom, and the couple of takeaways on this report is hard. Starting over is hard, particularly when most people in the country of Georgia have only known one system. They're afraid to talk openly about their feelings, the command and control economy, the police state, for lack of a better word. Try to create a democracy out of that is very difficult, but I am very pleased at the progress. Many challenges await the country of Georgia. This report has basically three questions. What can the United States do? What can Georgia do? What can Europe do to make this a success story? On the United States front, we have the ability to supplement Georgian defense, and we should. So I'm a big believer in providing defense capability to the people of Georgia. It is a stabilizing event, not destabilizing. And the threats that the country of Georgia faces are real. You have boundary disputes, you have territorial disputes, you've had recent engagement with Russia. And it is my hope that the United States will provide military assistance in a responsible way. So that's one thing we can do, help Georgia defend herself. The other thing we can do is provide economic assistance and technical assistance to the people of Georgia as they develop their institutions, and to make sure that the 200 and something years of experiment here in democracy in the United States, that we can share our mistakes as well as our successes and be more engaged in strengthening civil society, and just basically bolster the concept of free open media and provide technical expertise that this country is uniquely capable of doing. We can support Georgia at the WTO. We can make sure the Russians know we're watching, and that the international community led by the United States is going to expect better behavior from the Russians, and that you resolve disputes of territory not through force of arms, but through negotiations and the rule of law. We can, as I said, improve defense capability, support economic development along the U.S.-Georgia Free Trade Agreement. That would be very helpful. We can urge our European allies to be more embracing of EU admission and NATO admission. Now, what does Georgia need to do? Empower the Parliament, strengthen judicial independence, facilitate a free media, support a competitive electoral environment, and we see progress. We have challenges. The power of the personality of the president is real. It's supported widely throughout the country, but democracy is not based on personality. It's based on systems. So my hope is that the Georgian people will really focus on systems that are sustainable beyond people's personality. The great legacy of this president would be to leave behind an independent judiciary, to have at least two parties who can compete for the hearts and minds of the Georgian people, and to have a free media that can openly criticize the government and put on the table ideas that make everybody in democracy stronger. The economic growth, energy opportunities for the people of Georgia are unlimited, and we would like to be helpful in that regard to create an economy where Georgia can share into the abundant resources in the region, provide transportation hubs for energy access to other nations, a really exciting opportunity on the economic front. So the Atlantic Council, I think, has done a very good job of giving us a roadmap, what the United States can do, very healthy suggestions on the defense side, on the economic side, what we can be doing to help Europe embrace Georgia in a more open way. I think the Atlantic Council report has exposed problems inside of Georgia. There will be challenges to the political infrastructure and the people of Georgia. The good news for us is that there's wide acceptance for all sectors of Georgian society to embrace the West. And we need to build upon that and not let that be lost over time. So the report is very comprehensive, and it's a good roadmap for all of us. Now, on the European side, this dependence on energy supplies from Russia is real. I want a win-win situation with Russia. I want Europe to have a win-win situation. But our Russian friends have sometimes used energy in a very unhealthy way. And I think they have a view of reconstructing the old Soviet Union in a new way that we need to challenge. You know, Prime Minister Putin, who will probably be president again, I don't think we've hit the reset button quite yet. It's very unnerving what you hear coming out of Russia. It is, they're going backwards, not forwards, when it comes to democratic reforms. And they do try to intimidate their neighbors in an unhealthy way. And we need to let the Russian people know and their government that you're welcome to be part of the world community, but you have to abide by certain norms. So at the end of the day, I think the European community needs to reach out and reward Georgia and should make the political reforms necessary to become a member of NATO, European Union. We need to designate a clear path forward. That if you do certain things to improve the institutions in Georgia and embrace democratic ideals, that there will be a pathway forward. You desire to associate with the European Union, you desire to be a member of NATO, and you should be rewarded, in my view, not only by the United States, but the European community. And they should send a very clear signal, Europeans should, to the people of Georgia that you're welcome. You have to have certain things you have to do with your military, certain institutional reforms you have to make, But the idea that we will embrace you in the West should be very much in the forefront of everyone's thinking. And if the Russians try to chill out that thinking, we should push back. My hope is that as we recreate out of the ashes of the Soviet Union democracies, that over time Russia, I think the best thing that can happen to a country is to be surrounded by people who believe in the rule of law, who believe in free and fair elections, who believe in an independent judiciary. And the only way you can possibly be threatened by these institutions is if you don't believe in that concept yourself. So being surrounded by emerging democracies is a welcome news if I live in Russia. Because in Israel, you're not surrounded by democracies. Iraq is not surrounded by friends. You got Syria and Iran. So when our Russian friends try to intimidate democratic development in Georgia and other places, we in the West need to push back. So this report by the Atlantic Council, I think, is the most extensive, reasoned pathway forward in terms of the future of this country of Georgia vis-a-vis Europe, the United States, and the world at large that I've hoped for. Senator Shaheen has been a great ally. She has a big heart for the people in the country of Georgia. And together we will continue to work through the Congress, lobbying our allies to provide the military support Georgia needs and economic assistance. And we will be friends of this new partnership. Again, the Arab Spring is a continuation of what started in Georgia and other places. We need to embrace it, but not forget the fact that it all started when the Soviet Union collapsed. And if Georgia's a success story, it will breed more democratic efforts throughout the world. If for some reason Georgia fails because of intimidation from a big neighbor or collapse within, it will be a very sad day. Let's not let that sad day happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. It's now my honor to introduce Senator Jeanne. She was the first woman elected governor of New Hampshire, and then the first woman elected to the Senate from her state. She chairs the Europe Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and is also a member of Energy and Natural Resources, Armed Services, and Small Business. She also presided over the first hearing on Georgia after the 2008 war. And let me say that it's been a real honor to have as our co-chairs these two senators who both have reputations for working across the aisle. That's not always common these days, and we very much appreciate it, and we're delighted to include an example of that by printing the text of their joint resolution on Georgia as an annex in the report. So let me turn the floor to you.
I will take the podium and then come back down. I assume we will have some questions at the end. I'm delighted to be here with all of you for the release of this report that has been done by the Atlantic Council's Georgia Task Force. And I'm happy to have been able to work with Lindsey as the co-chair on this report. As you point out, there's not enough bipartisanship going on in the Senate and in Congress today, and so I think wherever we have examples, we should tap those. I want to congratulate Dana Wilson and Fran Burwell and everyone at the Atlantic Council for all of the good work that has been done in producing this report. It really has been an impressive team that they put together, and they looked very comprehensively at what we should be thinking about as we look at the future of Georgia. As Dr. Burwell explained, Senator Graham and I earlier this year passed a resolution on Georgia's territorial integrity in the Senate. And I think that effort, like this report and like the work of the Atlantic Council, has helped to keep this issue in the forefront as people are thinking about the the foreign policy issues that the country and the world are facing. I think one of the goals of the task force that's been working on this issue has been to try and build a strong bipartisan consensus on how we can support policies moving forward toward Georgia, and to refocus the efforts of the Euro-Atlantic community on Georgia's integration into that community, and to hopefully raise questions not just for us in Washington, but also for Tbilisi and for Brussels. And I think it's important to point out, as I'm sure Senator Graham did, that the report really presses all three governments to think about how we should support Georgia moving forward. I know you're all here because you understand why Georgia is important, but I think it's worth repeating that, as Senator Graham said, this is a young democracy in a very difficult neighborhood. Success for democracy there is going to be very important. It's important for American security interests. It's strategically located. It's a critical supplier of energy in an important region of the world in the South Caucasus. It's also been a strong contributing member of NATO and has been very helpful to the NATO effort in Afghanistan. But again, as I think Senator Graham said very eloquently, Georgia's about more than just its geopolitical location in the world and its importance to security. It's really about democracy and whether democracy and the experiment that's going on in Georgia is going to succeed in that part of the world. If Georgia's experiment in democracy succeeds, it will send a very important message to the rest of the world. And the country has made some very important strides in moving towards democracy, but as the task force report points out, there's still some ways to go. The report points out that our continued commitment to advancing Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration and to realizing a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace is critical. The Georgia Task Force report provides momentum and energy for further discussions on what we should do there. Now, one critical concern, as we all know, has been how Russia has behaved in Georgia. As you know, it's been 3 years since the South Caucasus saw a war break out between Russia and Georgia. Russian troops still occupy Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and we continue in the United States to call on Russia to end its occupation of Georgia's territory, to withdraw its forces, and to abide by its other commitments under the 2008 ceasefire. In addition, we believe that Georgia's future actually lies in their ability to take on important domestic reforms at home. Georgia's parliamentary elections in 2012 and its presidential election in 2013 are going to be key indicators of the success and durability of Georgia's democracy. This will be the first time an independent Georgia has been able, if it's successful, to transfer power from one peaceful democratic regime to another, a critical milestone as we move towards democracy. NATO support for Georgia will continue to be critical. As many of you know, at the 2010 NATO summit in Lisbon, NATO members agreed that Georgia would become an alliance member. However, there's been no roadmap laid out for how that should happen. No clear incentive for membership had been laid out. The task force report views the 2012 NATO summit in Chicago as an important opportunity for U.S. officials to advance and clarify NATO's commitment to Georgia's full integration by presenting a path forward for Georgia. So there is clearly a lot to be done, and responsibility lies within Georgia itself, within the EU and NATO, to look at how they can support Georgia's integration into Europe, and with the United States in ways that we can be supportive. I think the good news is we're seeing progress. The report indicates some critical recommendations for a path forward. Now the challenge is whether we're all going to be able to follow those recommendations and move forward in a way that continues to promote democracy in Georgia. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Senator Shaheen and Senator Graham for chairing this task force and for helping to kick off our launch today. When we began this project, I was accused by some of parochialism and selection of our senators as task force chairs. People that know me know that my father's side of the family, we have a family farm on the Vermont-New Hampshire border. And so I followed Senator Shaheen's career very closely through New Hampshire politics. But I grew up in my home state is South Carolina. And so despite the accusations of parochialism, we turn to these two senators for the reasons you've seen today, because they care about, they think about, and they've done a tremendous amount of work on the issue of Georgia. Senator Shaheen, in your position on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chairing the Europe Subcommittee, has put Georgia on the Senate's agenda, very critically calling the first hearing in the wake of the 2008 war. Senator Graham has been one of the most active members of the Senate from his perch on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and has been a frequent visitor to Georgia itself. I think with your indulgence, we may have a few minutes for questions and comments from the audience for Senator Shaheen before she has to move on, and then Fran and I will continue to walk through some of the more specifics of the task force report. For those of you who would like to ask a question, please catch my eye, and then if you could move to the back, there is a microphone in the back standing where one of our colleagues is. Please, who would like to help kick us off? Please, if you could take the microphone in the back, that would be helpful. And introduce yourself so we are aware.
And can you also just tell us what organization you are with?
Yes, my name is Josh Kuchera. I'm a freelance journalist, so I don't actually represent the organization. But there's several recommendations in your report that would cross a variety of red lines with Russia, selling arms to Georgia, positioning U.S. forces in Georgia, NATO expansion. And I know that this effectively amounts to kind of a blackmail by Russia, saying that if you do these things, then it's going to spoil our relations. Michael McFaul, the ambassador nominee to Russia, just testified yesterday that Russia has allowed 1,500 overflights to Afghanistan. The cooperation with Russia is getting more important as relations with Pakistan get more difficult in getting forces to cargo and so on to Afghanistan. My question is, can you explain why the recommendations in your report would give us more strategic benefits than the strategic damage that this would cause with Russia?
Well, I'm sure that both Damon and Dr. Burwell can comment on this, but I don't think we should look at this as a zero-sum game. Obviously, we have a reset policy with Russia. We're moving forward there on a variety of issues that are of concern to the United States, where we think we can cooperate. We also have a variety of interests in Georgia, and we need to look at ways in which we can support Georgia's emergence as a strong democracy in that part of the world, and we are already helping them in terms of providing training and assistance with respect to their military services, and so I think we need to look at our interest in Georgia as a separate issue.
If I just add to that, if I may, as we put this in context, I think part of what the task force was trying to argue is that the United States and Europe need clarity in their policy towards Georgia. Policy towards Georgia shouldn't be a function of policy towards Russia. And in that context, that's why we went back to the first principles about what is the vision that underpins the policy direction we want to move for Georgia. And that's a Georgia that's embedded in the institutions of Europe. It's a democratic, independent, sovereign Georgia that becomes a member of NATO and the European Union. And it's from that premise that we follow through on the policy conclusions that we can get into a little bit more in detail as we walk through the specifics after this. Can I turn to others, Board, please? Mike.
Hi, thank you. Marion Smith, the Heritage Foundation. If the United States is going to perhaps cross some of those quote-unquote red lines with Russia that the previous questioner mentioned, I think it's going to require a sustained level of support from the American people. What's the sort of best case for presenting the need for America to support Georgia and its move towards the West that we can make to the American people in this current political cycle and also in the context of the budget debates?
Usually when I'm out in New Hampshire these days, I'm talking about jobs. I'm not talking about Georgia. But one of the things that people in New Hampshire are concerned about is what's happening in the rest of the world. And they have an interest in seeing that democracy is promoted around the world and that we're supporting those emerging democracies to continue to be strong. Because if we can ensure that, if we can help so that there's not another conflict in this part of the world, so that there are not resources that are being used by us and by others of our allies to address those conflicts, then the people of New Hampshire and the rest of the country all benefit from that. So I think Americans understand that it's important for us to support those countries that would like to become independent, that would like to give their people a say in how the country is governed. I mean, just witness the reaction to the Arab Spring here in America and how enthusiastic people in America have been to see people throughout the Middle East having a say, or wanting to have a say in governing themselves.
Please do that. If you can go to use the mic in the back, please. All the way to the back.
Thank you very much. I'm Iftihar, work for Voice of America. My question is Georgia, before is independent and a democratic country, one of the challenges would be territorial integrity to preserve. So what the United States can do and how it would be reflected in its policies in the future to help Georgia?
Well, one of the things that is going on right now, and in fact, Dr. McFall talked about that yesterday when he was talking, there was a question about Russia accession into the WTO and how their continued support for occupation, their continued occupation of Georgia was going to affect that. And one of the things he talked about was the efforts with the Swiss to try and mediate with the international community and more monitors to protect the border areas, to make sure that there's freedom of movement between those territories and the rest of Georgia, and that peace is maintained there. And I think our support for those kinds of negotiations are important. Do you all want to add?
I might just pick up on that point because the Senate resolution that Senator Shaheen and Senator Graham sponsored is actually not just a rhetorical tool, but I think it's an important part of answering the question that you just asked. We may take it for granted today that Western nations would never recognize that South and South Ossetia as independent states, and I think that's true. But if you think about a long-term Russian strategy, it's to promote their independence or even potentially annexation. Part of the things that the Senate resolution does, the clarity in Western policy today, it helps very much, I think, establish resolve over the long term and put sufficient markers in place right now, today, in terms of Western policy in support of Georgian territorial integrity. We picked up this point in our report because many of us were very aware during the Cold War, much of the cynicism that was that U.S. policy towards the Baltic states received, a U.S. policy during the Cold War that did not recognize the Soviet Union's incorporation of the Baltic states. And many thought that was a quaint and outdated policy. But it was a policy that was quite important to help in terms, and set some of the long-term markers in terms of our principles there. And I think in many respects, the Senate resolution is a key element of putting in place the building blocks that ensure that we've done what we need to do to protect Georgia's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, have a long-term strategy, even though while in the near term, I think coupling the long-term strategy with a short-term strategy to try to advance more clearly the goal of their integration into Europe, into NATO. I don't know if you want to add to that at all.
I would just say that in terms of some of the red lines with Russia, I think we need to keep in mind that, for example, the overflights towards Afghanistan are in Russia's interests as well. So we need to be clear about when Russia is doing it as a favor to us and when it is in their interest. And I would argue that most of what they are doing for is in their interest. I think also that in terms of figuring out how we treat Abkhazia and especially Abkhazia, also South Ossetia, the Sochi Olympics, Winter Olympics, offers both a big challenge and an opportunity. There may be occasions of erosion of those territories' coherence with Georgia in terms of Russian construction and things like that. And we need to be alert to that. We're not suggesting boycotts or anything like that, but we need to be alert to those things, and we need to maybe see if this can be an opportunity to move the dialogue forward, to find some kind of way.
But the other reality is if people in those territories see that Georgia is a functioning democracy, that their economy is strong, that people have, that there's a rule of law, that human rights are respected, that there's a free press, and they don't see that in Russia, then they're going to have an interest in being part of Georgia, not in being continued to be occupied by Russia. So seeing the changes internally within Georgia is the best argument for the country to maintain its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. And on that note, I have to leave. Thank you all very much.
I'm going to ask our question.
I was trying to ask the question to Senator Shaheen, but I understand you must leave, so.
Right, sir, why don't you pick your question?
I am director of
Sir, I'm going to pick up our conversation and come back to questions. So after that's now, so if you could just hold your question for a moment, that would be terrific. Thank you. So we had a chance for the two senators to set the scene, set the stage for the purpose of this report, some of the key highlights, and some of the impetus for their involvement. Fran and I would like to take a few minutes to sort of walk through a little bit more of the specifics of what the task force has done with that. And thank you, sir, for your indulgence. We'll then pick up some more questions in the conversation. I want to start basically with the premise and then get into the three pillars of how we've talked about this policy. As you heard from Senator Graham, we very intentionally approached the issue of Georgia from three perspectives. To get this right, American policy, European policy, and Georgian actions have to be in sync, mutually reinforcing, and moving towards the same goal. And I think our concern at the beginning of this is in the aftermath of the 2008 war, U.S. and European policy was at best unclear and at worst divided on what we were ultimately willing to offer democratic Georgia. So we've argued that we need clarity first principles. We need clarity on first principles that underpin our policy. So as we talked about, that's why our long-term horizons require to think about achieving the goal of Georgia that is fully embedded in the West and its institutions and united with its occupied territories. But to get to that long-term vision, we need a coherent action strategy today that advances the integration aspect of this more rapidly. And that means the Western policy today needs to be clear about laying the groundwork for the long term on the occupied territories, while aiming to advance Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration in the near term, regardless of what's happening in Russia. And that's why we've advocated what we call here a policy of hold close, push hard. It's a policy in which we unequivocally embrace the vision of Georgia in NATO and in the European Union. And we in turn press Georgia to actually meet the high standards that it's set for itself. In the process of integration through Central and Eastern Europe, engagement carried the promise of membership. It incentivized reforms. And while there are certain challenging aspects to the integration we're talking about with Georgia, that formula is not broken. We need to have that formula on offer. So we proposed a process of going on offense, if you will, diplomatically. Going on offense to prevent what we fear to be a creeping annexation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And to do this against the backdrop of 2012, 2013 is very important markers of the first democratic transfer of power. So this report lays out a roadmap, incentives, benchmarks, conditionality, but also a clear goal. And we argue that to get this right, U.S. leadership on policy is key. The U.S. has to lead if this is to fall in place. But it can't work without Europe doing its fair share, because Europe has a lot of the tangible benefits that come to the citizens of Georgia as Georgia becomes Europeans. And all of this has to be fueled and backed up by Georgia itself moving forward with its aspirations, its reforms. We took a task force trip to Georgia as part of this process, and we came back with some striking conclusions from that trip. One was the depth of popular support in Georgia for this vision of the country embedded in the West. It crossed all political lines, across civil society, those in government and out. An incredible track record of reform that has made astonishing progress on ridding Georgia of corruption, facilitating real economic growth, but it's also at the same time centralized power. We also took away a sense that security dominates everything. The question of insecurity impacts politics and impacts economics. We took away the sense that what the U.S. both says and does has a tremendous impact in the country, and that the lack of clarity, the lack of policy from the European Union, the ambiguity coming from the European Union in our view, was a real problem in Georgia. So against that backdrop, let me quickly walk through some of our recommendations on Georgia's policy and U.S. policy, and then turn to Fran on Europe. So our argument is that with great expectations comes great responsibility on the part of Georgia as part of this process. It will earn its place in the Euro-Atlantic community through the transformation it does at home, that has at home. I think part of what we've recognized is, yes, Georgia's contribution to alliance operations shows that Georgia is already acting as if it were an ally. It's playing a critical role as an energy transit between Central Asia and Europe. But our recommendations come across several categories. First, as you heard from Senator Graham, bolstering Georgia's democratic institutions, empowering the parliament, particularly as it moves to pregnancy, strengthening judicial independence as jury by trial is introduced in Georgia, ensuring that civil society and the political opposition participates in the electoral and democratic process rather than boycotting that process, facilitating free media, including clarity on media ownership, and supporting this competitive electoral environment by getting greater buy-in on electoral reform, paying attention to protecting opportunities for opposition financing, and introducing the direct mayoral elections as it's done completely nationwide. But at the same time, a real policy of protecting Georgia's territorial integrity. Georgia's policy of fostering regional integration Regional integration and cooperation will only strengthen Georgia's drive towards Euro-Atlantic community, not challenge that. But at the same time, managing the sensitivity of some of the delicate relationships in the region, for example, with Belarus or Iran. Facilitating humanitarian aid and building bridges across the occupation lines as part of the engagement strategy of Georgia as a critical element of getting the dynamic right. Coordinating WTO policy with Western allies, and we'll come back to that. And fostering also sustainable economic growth in Georgia is another pillar of this. Reinforcing encouraging investments that reinforce its role as an energy transit country. Hydropower generation, support for the EU gas pipeline. Focusing on job creation. Unemployment and underemployment is a tremendous challenge in Georgia, particularly the reform of the agriculture sector. And strengthening the investment climate, responding quickly to tax abuse cases, improving auditing rules and such. Against that backdrop, we think the context in which Georgia is acting is most important. And this is where U.S. policy comes into play. We've already talked about the democracy assistance, and I think as one of the questions alluded, this isn't really about more money in Georgia. I think retaining the idea of democracy assistance at the core of foreign aid is right, makes sense, and supporting clear steps on electoral reform, support for civil society, and bolstering free media. But also a more aggressive policy of protecting Georgia's territorial integrity. I think in this aspect, we've argued for holding Russia accountable for its occupation. This is where we'd like to see policy, U.S. policy enshrined, either via executive order, report to Congress, policy statements from the administration, something that formally labels Russia's presence in Abkhazia and South Ossetia's occupation, and institutionalizes U.S. policy denying Abkhazia and South Ossetia recognition as independent states. But also holding Russia account to its legal obligations, protection of minorities, fundamental right of safe return for IDPs, and pushing more coherently for an internationalization, particularly of those areas that were formerly ethnically populated, Georgian ethnically populated areas, Gali, Kadori, Afghori. We also, as part of an argument for going on offense diplomatically, have put forward some ideas. Part of our concern is that in the diplomatic sphere, it's very easy to roll into a very status quo approach to Geneva talks, a response to Russian actions and proposals. And our concern is that we need to go on offense and challenge that. So we argue for proposing an international security presence in the occupied territories. This means actually laying out a clear vision for what security in Abkhazia and South Ossetia would look like if there was a full implementation of a ceasefire agreement. That's what our expectation of the agreement should be. We need to lay out what that means. We've argued for supporting Georgia in the context of the World Trade Organization, and that we should address Georgia's concerns, urge Russia to agree to an international regime, in which we would have customs monitoring points on the border crossings between the international border of Russia and Georgia. Also improving security and defense cooperation. In this context, the upcoming NATO summit in Chicago in May 2012 is an important marker. We think that summit needs to be used to concretely advance Georgia's aspirations by agreeing a more intensified package of cooperation, making clear that the NATO-Georgia Commission is Georgia's path to membership in the alliance. Actually, the annual national program is the mechanism for which Georgia can achieve membership, and hosting the first ever leader-level summit of the NATO-Georgia Commission in Chicago. At the same time, bolstering the U.S. footprint in Georgia, normalizing military relations, and in this context, picking up on what Senator Graham said, moving forward with assisting Georgia with developing credible defense plans, and normalizing the fact of defensive honor cells to Georgia, doing so in conjunction with our allies. We've also advocated for the United States joining the European Union Monitoring Mission. Furthermore, on U.S. policy, a more aggressive way to facilitate Western investment, continuing OPIC financing to buffer the political risks associated with long-term investment in Georgia, more aggressively using international financial institution support to support actual job creation in Georgia, both through agricultural reform support and through our support for the Millennium Challenge Corporation. launching a U.S.-Georgia free trade agreement, and banking international financial investment along the lines of occupation so that it helps facilitate cross-border movement along these lines. Let me stop there with those concrete recommendations and turn to Fran for the European Union recommendations.
Thanks, Damon. Let me join with Damon in thanking our task force members. And let me also thank Cindy Romero, who was the intrepid rapporteur on this report. If you look at the list of task force members, you'll see the wide diversity of opinions. And she was the one who negotiated the draft, if you can put it that way. And many of you know what a challenge that is. There are basically two elements of this that Damon has laid out. First, Georgia's need to continue forward with its own reforms. And second, how the U.S. can support this effort by pushing Georgia hard to continue reforms while supporting Georgia's Euro-Atlantic ambitions and holding strongly to our commitment to Georgia's territorial integrity. But there's a third essential element to this equation, and that's European involvement. And so I'm very much pleased to see representatives from so many European embassies here today. Europe must be involved in encouraging Georgia to move forward, and at the same time, retain strong support for Georgia's Euro-Atlantic ambitions. Let me state the obvious. For Georgia to eventually get into NATO, all allied nations must agree. That's the US, Canada, and 26 European nations. Even after the Bucharest Pledge, we have a situation in Europe where many remain skeptical of Georgia as a responsible ally and believe that President Saakashvili did not respond to Russian provocation in the most measured way in 2008. And this situation needs to be worked on. For Georgia to accede to the EU, there are several points along the accession trail when progress must be approved by all member state governments, a high barrier to any country. The EU is the leading trade partner of Georgia, 32% of Georgian trade of exports and imports combined. The US, on the other hand, is number 5. We are behind Turkey, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, with 8% of Georgian trade. Neither the US nor Europe has really truly significant investments in Georgia at this time. Not what we'd like to see. Europe is more likely over the long term. And Georgia is increasingly important for Europe as an energy corridor and will be more so in the future. Europe will also feel the impact of whatever happens in Georgia through migration and other forces more than we will here in the United States. So Europe has a bigger stake in Georgia's success and has more tools to help build that success. The EU has tremendous experience in assisting transitions to democracy. Just look at Poland today, and the fact that we have former Solidarity activists here representing the European Parliament is, I think, quite notable. It shows you what can happen in 20 years. But EU accession is an incredibly granular process, much, much more difficult and demanding than NATO membership. The EU consistently increases its demands with each new country, or each new set of countries that seeks accession. And it should be noticed that for the European Partnership, the Eastern Partnership countries, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, Belarus, and Ukraine, there's not yet a membership perspective, so the major carrot is not yet there. If we assume that Georgia will not get a membership perspective in the next immediate future, which I think is probably the case, then for Europe, the rhetoric on Georgia should change to be more positive. Georgia needs carrots, and Europe needs to present a stronger vision of Georgia as a Euro-Atlantic country, as part of Europe all free and at peace. Europe also needs to find some concrete ways to reward Georgia through strengthening the Eastern Partnership in a variety of measures. One possibility that we've recommended is establishing a roadmap to visa-free travel. This needs to be coordinated because otherwise, it needs to be coordinated with EU-Russia policy, because otherwise, the arrangements that are being made for Russian passport holders may in fact privilege those in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, who hold Russian passports. They may get into the EU more easily than a Georgian who carries, someone who carries a Georgian passport. That's again unfortunate. The EU can support Georgian democracy by providing assistance to civil society more than it has done in the past. And we now have a very strong proposal for a European endowment for democracy. And that could be a major funder of such activities. Europe should also, as Daniel was mentioning earlier, delink its policy from the EU partnership from its Russia policy. It should be clear that integration into Europe is up to the potential members and the EU, and should not be constrained by Russia or others. Europe can also support Georgia in its territorial integrity. The EU monitoring mission has been an important part of the post-war, environment in Georgia. But let's go a little bit farther. Let's push Russia on its non-compliance with the ceasefire, and let's see about maybe increasing the number of countries who participate in the EUMM. We mentioned the possibility of the US participating. The EU also needs to clarify what it means by engaging Abkhazia and South Ossetia without recognizing them. How do you deal with local civil society groups and others without necessarily privileging governments that are not the legitimate government? So that's a question we should have a discussion across the Atlantic about that and how we can work those issues together. Finally, we need to deepen Georgia's economic integration with Europe. Senator Shaheen made the point about how those in Abkhazia and South Ossetia should someday look to Georgia and see Georgia as prosperous, moving forward economically, and this is what will make them want to come back to Georgia, want to get rid of the current situation. The EU is currently talking with Georgia about opening negotiations for a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. We would encourage the Europeans to open those negotiations sooner rather than later. But that agreement should be based on a standard of economic regulation which is compatible with Georgia's economic level of development. The one that is being proposed, the standards that are being put before the Georgians right now are extremely strict and probably much more suitable for a country with a higher level of economic growth where citizens have a higher per capita income. We also need to find more ways to encourage European investment in Georgia, perhaps through something like what we have here, which is OPIC, which guarantees guarantees investments against risk. And we also need, as Europe goes through its negotiations with Russia on the final stages of whether Russia will join the WTO, we need to keep Georgia in the loop on that. And we need to also we need to also discourage Georgia from wanting to play the spoiler on that and falling into that. Let's make Russia stand up and make this decision on its own, whether it will come to agreement with the WTO. Let me end by saying that this is Washington, not Brussels. We cannot here on our own get Georgia into NATO, and we certainly can't get Georgia into the EU. What we can do is encourage our Georgian friends to take the need for further reform very seriously and to help them develop the capacities to take on the responsibilities of NATO and EU membership. We can also encourage our European friends to provide the positive incentives that are essential in making Georgia a true member of the Euro-Atlantic community. Thanks.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you very much. Just one quick word, and then I want to bring you, open up the conversation. I think we began this with the premise that security is one of the greatest challenges to Georgia's path to the West. We have a backdrop as we talk about this of Russia remains in violation of the broken ceasefire agreement that ended the war. It's occupying Abkhazia, South Ossetia, increasing its military presence, seeking to destabilize Georgia, to delegitimize its political leadership. It's against this backdrop that we've argued we can't afford a sense of ambiguity and lack of clarity and division in Western policy. Our policy goals need to be clear. That's why we begin with first principles of laying out a vision and backing that vision up with a very particular roadmap on that path to integration. Many of us involved in European policy in the 90s were in an environment in which there was a tremendous amount of skepticism about the Baltic states, that they could one day be members of NATO, and the European Union. And yet their performance, combined with US leadership, helped shift the debate, transforming their idea of membership from a radical notion to a natural outcome. I think today, if you look at Georgia, the Georgian people have an audacious vision. Nearly 90% of the Georgian people, according to a range of opinion polls, they see their country in the West. They won't be held back. They see their country in favor of the European Union. Those are astounding numbers, far higher than we saw in most countries that joined these institutions. So our task force argues that US and European policy should be aimed at making that audacious vision a reality. And as Georgians believe that the West, that NATO, and that the United States and Europe, that we share this vision, that we share the end goal with them, they in turn, I think, will have more confidence when it comes to making the tough internal decisions that are necessary to move forward despite the situation of regional insecurity. So in many respects, we view that the Georgian people have made the choice about the destiny and the future they want. And in that choice, they deserve our support in getting there. So with that, I'd like to open up the conversation and continue our conversation. I think Ambassador Yakubashvili, would you like to kick us off? You can either take the photo or either way, that's fine. You're right here. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Take the Senate button.
Please do, please do.
Thank you. Today, this morning, I read you in my car telling me that the only cool people are those who are occupying Wall Street, either from inside or outside. But I see that there are many cool people here already, not in Wall Street. And it encourages me because these cool people are coming here to hear about Georgia. And they do care about Georgia, and it's very important for us, for Georgians, because every small nation is aspiring to find friends around the globe. And we are extremely privileged that paper which is produced about Georgia was co-chaired by two very prominent senators. And I want to express our gratitude for that leadership that these particular senators and the United States is showing over my country. This report is not, for Georgian perspective, is not a mirror that we can look at mirror and see ourselves. Because when I look at the mirror when I'm going to the party, I look differently. After hangover, I look differently. And definitely, it's not an X-ray that goes through you and shows your bones. I think it's much more complicated and sophisticated. It's more a 3D image of Georgia. It's more computer tomography that shows you more information than just one glance or one story in one particular time. And that's why I think that this report has a huge value because it gives you so much information about different parts of the body called Georgia. Of course, the patient is always rebelling and saying that you don't tell me that I have a blood pressure high or low or something like that. And obvious inclination from Galway to Georgia should be, we disagree on the things that are written here. But I can tell you that our position is very simple. We appreciate what is written there. Even things that we don't particularly like, we accept it from the friends as things to fine-tune, to fix, to take a second look, or to think about it at least. And I think that the value of this kind of exercises cannot be underestimated. Because in this process of transformation, you may lose some sense of reality, you may lose some important things behind, and you need a friend, and very honest and very open friends to tell you what is wrong with you and what is working and what is not. One of the greatest value of this paper is also answering the basic question that a lot of people are asking me in this country. And the basic question is why we should care about it. Why US or Europe should care about Georgia. And I think in this paper, that question is very well answered. As Senator Graham mentioned, Senator Shaheen was also elaborated on this question as well. And if you will enlarge it, you will see that Georgia is the most advanced success case of transformation in the last 7 years, or 10 years. And we are talking about the world that is very turbulent, and people are trying to give some kind of name or title of what is happening in the world, not only in the Middle East, but in Europe, in the United States. So I don't know what is happening. I don't have a ready-made answer, but I can see that world became much more complex than it used to be. And the methodology that we are going to employ will differ very much from the methodology that we are using. And we already see that everything goes not macro, micro, or global, but goes nano. So probably we need some kind of nano diplomacy to handle these issues. And Georgia is, this nano picture of Georgia, actually, a detailed picture of Georgia gives you some answers that can be replicated in other parts of the world. People sitting in this room own the success of Georgia as well. I don't want to go into the details. You know. And it was not only us, it was enormous help from our friends that we managed to take country from being called country of tribes and tribes into the successful model of transformation. I was at the Yale University last week, and a lot of people were coming to me and asking about how we did with corruption, how we managed to fight the corruption. And of course, I was ready to extend my knowledge in this regard. And the first advice was, you don't create a special bureaus for it. It should be a job of entire government. You have to own it. And all the reforms that are happening in Georgia, we own them. We are responsible for them. We also bear responsibility if they fail. But it's a very challenging and interesting exercise to take country quickly out of the disparity and to have a functioning democracy. And it's very rewarding. Missing part in that exercise is security. I was reading again a very interesting book called After Victory, written by John Eichenberg, who is elaborating why the Second World War was, what happened after the Second World War brought to Europe peace and stability. And the key element there is the security. The key element there is the NATO. The key element is that the European countries had an opportunity to look at themselves without looking at others and buying guns and tanks and things like that. Building democracy under gunpoint is not an easy task. We are more or less managing, but I think it's a high time that we will be more relaxed in that regard. And the more relaxation can come only through Euro-Atlantic family membership, and that's membership in NATO. And I do think and agree with the report and the senators that it's a high time now that Georgia will get clarity about its NATO membership in the upcoming summit in Chicago. It is happening in US. US is a leading country in this process, and I think that the US should take a leadership in granting to Georgia together with European allies either membership action